Hey everyone, this is Ezekiel O'Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at what happened in December 2021 in paleontology. And there was already one video on this by someone who also helped with the Paleo Rewind hosted by Edge and his channel. And they looked at some papers in greater detail, whereas what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going through a lot of papers with much shorter detail. So if you want to keep up to date on more of the things rather than greatly in depth with the things, this will be a better video for that, but also check out that other video. Pneumatics in relation to bones just means that there's air sacs that are helping to support those bones. And it's been something that's been suggested in a lot of dinosaurs, and that's largely because it is found in birds today. They have pneumaticized skeletons. And it's really hard to actually get solid evidence for this occurring in dinosaurs. But a sauropod vertebra coming from South America does actually show one of the pneumatopores, which is essentially where that air sac would have fit alongside the vertebra. And it's able to show that at least some of the dinosaurs did have this. Now, this is only the 5th time that this has been found in non-avian dinosaurs. So any real data points that we do have are still very helpful, even if it's just one, like with the sauropod. And also it can help us to start understanding, at least hopefully, how different amounts of pneumatization may have actually evolved in the dinosaurs and then led up to the birds eventually taking flight. Moving to the water, Cymbospondylus is already a pretty well-known genus of ichthyosaur, and there's actually a few species within that genus that have been found. And now there's a new one, Cymbospondylus youngorum, and it's really unique because it is massive. Coming from Nevada, it could potentially rival the size of some of the largest whales today, being around 55 feet in length or about 17 meters. So again, very, very large. But even more important than just the large size is how quickly it attained that size. Because Cymbospondylus youngorum comes from rocks that are just 3 million years younger than the Permian-Triassic extinction, when a lot of life in the oceans and a lot of life on land died out. And essentially we think that the ichthyosaurs only started to evolve after that extinction, which means within 3 million years they went from probably relatively small animals to absolutely massive marine predators. And that's actually really unique because when we look at other animals that did move to more marine environments, like whales, we do not see that same pattern. Because the first whales, once they got big, it still took another 14 million years from the first whales to large animals like Basilosaurus. So there's a large difference between 3 million years and 14 million years. And understanding why they may have been able to evolve like that is something that could help us understand the early oceans during the Mesozoic. Cymbospondylus youngorum was also found with a lot of ammonites, which actually may have been a large portion of its prey. And so that might actually indicate that how the oceans recovered and the prey that was available may have been one of the main factors that dictated this kind of discrepancy in how quickly they attained large sizes, with the ichthyosaurs being more able to attain a lot of prey and then grow larger, whereas with whales and the extinction that happened before they evolved, there may not have been the same kind of development in that part of the ocean, meaning that they wouldn't have had as much prey to opportunize on and become as large as they eventually became. There's a lot that goes into understanding how active animals were, and one of the best proxies for this is by understanding their metabolism, specifically through how much blood flow would occur through the femur. And we can really see this in reptiles and mammals, where mammals allow a lot more blood to flow through the femur because they have higher metabolisms. And in fact, if you look at monitor lizards, they're actually able to approach a somewhat intermediate level, and this still tracks with the amount of blood going through their femurs. But the first mammal ancestors that weren't quite mammals may or may not have been warm-blooded. But what does the femur show? Well, a new study actually took samples of the femurs of some of the early synapsids to try and estimate this. And what they found is, while it wasn't quite as high of a metabolism as many of modern-day mammals, it was still higher than even the monitor lizards. So they could still actively hunt much more aggressively than other reptiles. However, they were also much more able to relax and calm down without needing to maintain that high metabolism to continue burning energy the way warm-blooded mammals do today. This may have been part of what led to their success in the Permian, although once the Permian-Triassic extinction occurred, a lot of them did die out and the reptiles were then able to take over, most notably in the form of the dinosaurs. And one of the more interesting finds of this year was actually a dinosaur coming from Chile. And it actually came from the early Cretaceous of Chile, and it was an ankylosaur, but a really bizarre ankylosaur. Because while we mostly think of ankylosaurs as having big club-like tails, it had much more of a kind of battle axe tail. Named Stegosaurus elongatus, this new ankylosaur was also pretty small, and most of the bones indicate that it at least wasn't a juvenile or young one. It may have been an adult or subadult, so it was at least most of the way grown, despite being relatively small, especially when you compare it to much larger ankylosaurs, like Ankylosaurus, which was much, much larger. Now, phylogenetically, it forms a pretty consistent clade with many of the other southern ankylosaurs, like Antarctopelta, which comes from Antarctica. And this is important because that group may actually be closer to stegosaurs than it is to ankylosaurs. Now, in the phylogeny in the paper, they do still find it well within the ankylosaurs, but there is a suggestion, at least potentially, and we would need a lot more fossils to test it better, that the ankylosaurs may have just evolved directly out of the stegosaurs. And that could actually explain some of the transition we see during the early Cretaceous from more stegosaur-dominated environments in the late Jurassic into more ankylosaur-dominated environments in the Cretaceous. This then would mean that the more blade-like tail of Stegosaurus could potentially be a more derived sharp, pointy thagomizer of the stegosaurs, and then it just changed to become more blade-like and then more club-like as the ankylosaurs continued to evolve. Now, again, this will need a lot more fossils to test more thoroughly, and for now it does seem more reasonable to say that the ankylosaurs and the stegosaurs evolved separately. But there is at least a chance that maybe the ankylosaurs did evolve directly out of the stegosaurs. There's also a new fossil site coming from Italy, which actually shows a lot about a dinosaur that was already known, specifically Tethys hadros. And this is really important because this site is able to show that it lived earlier in the Cretaceous than was thought. This is important because during the late Cretaceous, Europe was pretty much a large archipelago with a lot of separate islands. And it's been proposed that on these separate islands, there was a lot of island dwarfism happening, where essentially large animals become smaller so that they're not competing for as many resources as you would find in a larger continent if they were living on a larger continent. Tethys hadros actually fit this idea pretty well because it was a bit smaller than most other hadrosauriforms, at least based on the one fossil we used to have. But now there's many more fossils coming from the site, including some that are adults and show that now is pretty much as big as any other hadrosauriform. So it doesn't really seem like there's any island dwarfism happening, at least for Tethys hadros. There's also some really interesting geology going on where some of these fossils have actually been folded, and very lightly folded, but you can see where the different axes of the folding are marked. And so essentially that just means that as the Alps uplifted, a lot of those geologic forces were forcing these rocks to bend, including the fossils inside of them. And so it really does help to show why you need at least some geologic background when you're trying to look for fossils. So you can try and understand A, what age the rocks are, and B, what kind of events may have happened to the rocks after they were buried. And staying in the Cretaceous of Europe, and specifically in early Cretaceous of the Wessex Formation in the UK on the Isle of Wight, there was a new dromaeosaur found. Earlier in 2021, there were some other dinosaurs that were named from the Isle of Wight, including some Spinosaurids, and this one is also a theropod, but it's one that wasn't really that well known from Europe at this time, because it's a dromaeosaur. Vectoraptor greeneye is known from just 3 vertebrae, and I will fully admit I think it's kind of silly to name an animal based off of only 3 vertebrae, but it does at least have enough features that show it was a dromaeosaur, and so probably closely related to actually some of the North American dromaeosaurs like Deinonychus, which also lived during the early Cretaceous. This may actually help to indicate that at least in the early Cretaceous, when we had thought that North America and Europe had fully broken apart, there may have been at least some land bridge still connecting those different parts of the world, allowing migration from parts of North America into Europe. And there have been a few other animals that have been found in places like Spain that may also suggest this, but it's really going to take someone coming together with a lot more data sets to try and actually prove that. But I really hope that they are able to look at that in more detail, because it would be really interesting to find out for sure. There's also a fossilized oviraptorine egg that was pretty unique. And this is important because oviraptor eggs actually get fossilized pretty regularly. The animals helping to guard them probably helped some of this preservation, but this one is unique because inside of it, you can actually see the embryo almost ready to hatch. And we know it's almost ready to hatch because of its posture. Studies of chicken eggs have actually helped to show this, because when you actually look at chicken eggs and the chicks inside of them, just before they hatch, they actually go through a couple of different postures. So it seems like this oviraptorine was actually just a few days from hatching. And there's another one that wasn't quite as well preserved, which seems to be in a similar stage, although a slightly different stage, of that posturing before hatching. We also have fossilized embryos from sauropod dinosaurs. And what that means is that since they don't have the same posturing, it's far more likely that this kind of behavior only really evolved in the theropod dinosaurs, so only in the lineage that led to the birds. And maybe it had some effect on their survival. It's hard to know exactly why it existed. It may have something to do with their ability to get out of the shell. may have something to do with their ability to get out of the shell and then immediately start being more able to take care of themselves, or it might even just have something with an association with actual nesting and sitting on the eggs. It's really hard to tell, and I don't know how you would test any of those ideas directly in the fossil record, but it may be something that led to the dinosaur success and eventually the bird success. The Yixian and Jiufotang formations of China are really famous for containing fossil birds and fossil dinosaurs that contain feathers. But they're not the only fossil-bearing layers in China from the early Cretaceous. And they're also not the only fossil layers in China from the early Cretaceous that show a lot of bird diversity. In fact, one of these formations comes from the Gansu province as opposed to the Liaoning province in China, and it contains two newly described types of fossil bird. Mimenavis ductrix and Brevidentavis zhangi are the newly described birds, and combined with what is known from the Yixian and Jiufotang formations, help to show that there was a lot of diversity in birds spread throughout at least China and parts of Central Asia. And that's actually really important because bird fossils are really hard to fossilize because they're so fragile. And so having this kind of evidence of a broad amount of diversity does help us to understand, at least potentially, that birds were pretty widespread during the early Cretaceous and occupying a lot of different niches as they were starting to evolve into different forms. And one of those different forms was actually named from the Jiufotang formation this past month as well, and it's been named Brevirostruavis macrohyoideus. And the microhyoideus there is an important part of its name, because the hyoid bone is a bone that helps to essentially attach many of the muscles that control the tongue. And macro just means it was big, so it had a very large bone for attaching tongue muscles. When you look in modern birds, these are pretty much found in birds that had very long tongues. So things like woodpeckers, which use their tongues to reach into bark and try and capture prey. And we're not entirely sure if it was doing that kind of behavior of reaching its tongue into different woods and logs to try and find little grubs to eat. However, it does help to show that there was a lot of new diversity that we don't fully understand in the bird fossil record. And that's even from places that have been well sampled, like the Jiufotang formation. So there's a lot going on in bird evolution that we don't fully understand just yet. There was also a special publication in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology about Quetzalcoatlus, and that just means that there were a bunch of papers all about Quetzalcoatlus that were all released together. And they cover a wide variety of things, including a reconstruction of the environment that would have been present in the Javelina Formation where some fossils of it have been found, to how it may have walked on land and actually gotten around. Now, there's a lot of papers in here, and I'm not really going to be able to touch on all of them. However, it is important to remember that A, these papers are all open access, so if you're interested, you can go read them. And then B, it's also important to know that there's still going to be a lot of debate about Quetzalcoatlus. This is not solving the debate at all. For example, one of the papers looking at its biomechanics suggested that when it was on the ground and trying to get into the air, it was likely to use its strong back legs to jump up. And that has some differing opinions because there's some researchers, like Michael Habib, who believe rather than using their back legs, they use their strong chest muscles to essentially do a very fast push-up and launch themselves into the air. But the really cool thing about these kind of differing opinions is Michael Habib was actually one of the peer reviewers for that paper. He looked at that paper and went, yeah, all of this still works. And that's one of those things where different opinions on how animals may have lived are still totally valid to have. It's just a matter of getting as much research out there as we can so that we can try and have the best picture possible. And for all I know, Michael Habib may have his own paper on Quetzalcoatlus and its flight mechanics and launching mechanics in the works. He's already done this for many other pterosaurs, so it wouldn't be shocking. And sometimes that's just how paleontology and other sciences work. You really need to sit there and let these researchers look at what they're doing and compare and contrast their data with other data. And it's very important that we're kind of coming together to try and help build the best picture of the past that we can. And jumping way back into the Precambrian, there's some fossils that may actually have at least some relation to vertebrates. And they wouldn't be vertebrates, they'd be chordates, because they're not quite vertebrates, they're actually tunicates, which tunicates today are very small filter feeders that mostly sit at the bottom of the sea, but they are closely related. I mean, you can see the family resemblance, not necessarily with the adults that sit at the seafloor, but with their larvae. For example, in their larvae, you can see an early notochord, which is very similar to a backbone, which helps to support many of the nerves that are actually going down the body. Additionally, you can start to see that they're starting to develop a head and many of the sensory organs on that head. It's actually very similar to the larvae of many early vertebrates, such as lamprey. As for the fossils themselves, some of them definitely look like they might be fossils. The thing is, tunicates don't really have a strong fossil record because they don't really have any hard parts that can fossilize well, so these may or may not actually be tunicate fossils. But at least these authors do suggest that, although there's probably still going to be a lot of debate about that. The important thing is this does help to push back the date of the first vertebrate, because if tunicates evolved, vertebrates on the other side of that branch would have also evolved by this point. So hopefully we can start finding some stronger evidence for how exactly these animals and when exactly these different groups started to evolve. Phylogenetic groups that are found can sometimes go unnamed for a very long time, and that's largely because of the amount of work that it takes to essentially make a very rigorous and organized way for naming these animals. Because you need to first show that they are closely related and form a clade without any other groups included within it, and then you need to be able to then name it according to the proper rules that are used for naming different groups. And one paper sought to do this with the Ornithischian dinosaurs. And in this paper, they actually named 81 different clades, although some of them were already named and they just helped to include and make a better definition for them, including things like Ankylosauridae, which is just the ankylosaurs. And so looking at the phylogeny that they present, each one of the little triangles on it is either a newly named clade, or it is a clade which was already named but had a more precise definition given so that it can be used more accurately in the future. Additionally, while it seems like there's relatively few animals in it, their data set, which was overall much larger, actually included a lot more. So it's not limited to just what you see here. And so this is really good because it does help us to understand how the different groups of Ornithischian dinosaurs may have been related to each other, at least based on current evidence and a lot of the different fossils of Ornithischians that we do have. The problem really comes from the fact that they couldn't resolve one of the most important questions about Ornithischians, which is where did they come from? Because the earliest ones we have are things like Pisanosaurus, which may or may not be an Ornithischian dinosaur. And if it's not, it's probably a Silosaur, which may or may not as a group be Ornithischian dinosaurs. So the fundamental problem becomes, are the Silosaurs dinosaurs or are they just outside of the dinosaurs? And until we can really solve that question, it's going to be really, really hard to try and prove where exactly the Ornithischians evolved from and which groups. Because by the time we have something that is distinctly Ornithischian, it is well after they should have started evolving. So it's really hard to know what exactly they were doing. And sticking with the dinosaur, we're going to be looking at Haast's eagle, which lived much, much closer to the modern day. In fact, it may have actually eaten people in New Zealand. It would have primarily fed on moa, so some of the largest birds in history, which would have stood at about 9 feet in height or around 3 meters. It itself, though, would have probably weighed about 30 pounds, or around 14 kilograms. And this is important because when you consider even other very large birds of prey today, like a Harpy's eagle, they don't weigh quite that much, being closer to 20 pounds, or around 9 kilograms. So there's a pretty big difference between Haast's eagle, the largest eagle ever known, and even large eagles today. But there's also been suggestions that rather than hunting moa, it may have actually just scavenged. And what does the evidence say is the real question here. And so researchers took a look at the evidence and actually presented some new evidence on what it would have done. And what they found is that, at least based on the talons, it very much hunted like an eagle. And that's because it had very large talons that, for its size, would have been stronger compared to those of something like a harpy eagle if you just scaled that harpy eagle up. So very, very strong talons, but additionally a very strong bite. And that's important because, at least in some modern day birds of prey, they will mostly catch prey with their talons, but they may finish it off with a bite. One of the things that is strange, though, is that part of the brain case isn't shaped like that of other eagles. And this means it couldn't do the same kind of pulling and tearing side-to-side motion that you expect to see in many modern birds of prey, where they mostly eat the muscles and the meat of whatever they catch. Instead, what they see is a brain case that is more similar to that of a vulture, specifically the Andean condor. And what the Andean condor does isn't trying to focus on these kinds of more meaty parts of the animal. Instead, it will focus on the organ meats and the softer internal parts. So what that gives us is a pretty good picture of what the Haast's eagle would have done. And that's, it would have caught prey with its talons, potentially killed it with a very strong bite, but then it would have, rather than eating the meat and muscle, primarily targeted the organs. And that's very different from any modern eagle. And that's important to note because it is actually related to eagles more than it is to vultures. It secondarily evolved this kind of more vulture-like skull shape. And we know this because genetic studies have been able to help show that it's actually closest related to the little eagle of Australia, which is honestly a little bit funny that the largest eagle in history was very closely related to something called the little eagle. It's not quite what you would expect, but it does help us understand how evolution, specifically on islands where in more isolated environments, can cause evolution to take off into radical new ways, where there weren't many large predators trying to prey on the moa. And so the Haast's eagle was able to take advantage of that niche and develop a very specific set of tools to try and take advantage of that niche. So if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that I like to talk about the ethics that surround paleontology. And there was a new paper on this that looked at how colonialism has affected our deep time understanding of the Earth's past. And what they found is that it's really not that helpful. And one of the ways they did this is by using essentially where the authors come from on different papers with fossils from different continents. And what they found is that there's a lot of areas which don't have a lot of authors writing on the fossils that are found essentially in their own backyards. It's important that we do start spreading education to these kinds of places so that we can actually have them start developing their own research within their own countries. Because that way we can, as a group, a larger group, as an international community, start developing these kinds of procedures to have a better understanding of what was happening in the geologic past. Because no one's going to know the rocks of places that are more isolated better than the people who live there. And having other researchers come in from somewhere else for a summer excursion to go find stuff and then ship it away isn't helpful for those communities in understanding their own pasts. The authors are also able to put up a fairly simplified graph of how these different factors actually interact with one another. And again, very simplified, but it does help. So you can see they have different factors listed here, with GDP being the gross domestic product, GPI being Global Peace Index, HDI is Human Development Index, and then EPI is the important one, the English Proficiency Index. Because so much of research is done in English and written in English, it does limit the development of paleontology in many of these places if they don't have a strong English-speaking culture. Which isn't to say that everyone should speak English, it's that we should be more accepting of people writing things in other languages and just getting those translated later on. Which just goes to show the impact that many colonial legacies can have on different places. For example, there's also this large web that is made looking at different nations and how they interact with one another, and the amount of papers they produce. And you can see South Africa is the largest one within Africa, because they have a very strong English-speaking condition due to colonialism. Now, apartheid was still very messed up, but at least there's that English background for paleontology. And despite being colonized by the English, it still doesn't have the same kind of number of papers that you see from many other countries. And that's despite it having some of the best places for paleontology in the world. That means that this also is not just about English speaking on the colonial legacy, but how it's affected the people specifically. Because if you have struggles of people trying to feed themselves but not being able to because all their food is being shipped elsewhere, it makes it very hard for people to prioritize on research rather than just trying to take care of themselves and their family. So hopefully by trying to end some of these kind of neo-colonial practices that do ship a lot of the resources in these countries away, we can actually have people start being able to A, take care of themselves better, and then B, they can hopefully be more able to participate in the international community for paleontology. And as for other papers, there was one paper that I already did a separate video on that looked at Kronosaurus. And Kronosaurus is a pretty famous pliosaur coming from Australia. The major problem with that animal, though, is that the original specimen of it is very partial. And so these authors looked at another animal that was named Kronosaurus coming from Colombia, and another one also from Australia, but in a different time period. And they gave each of those two specimens different names from Kronosaurus. And there's a lot of debate that's going to be happening about this because Kronosaurus is A, pretty much a mainstay of Australian paleontology, and B, it's been used so much for at least the other Australian specimens that it is somewhat reasonable to say you could just move the name to that new specimen. And why the authors didn't do this, I'm not entirely sure, and there will probably still be discussion about whether or not they should or should not do this in the future. You can check out the entire video for more. I go into a lot more depth on the history of taxonomy and essentially why you may or may not want to swap things. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I have a really cool announcement as far as paleontology research is going. I submitted an abstract on the research I am conducting to the Geological Society of America's Cordilleran Rocky Mountain Joint Section meeting, which is going to be in Las Vegas in March, and my poster abstract got accepted, so I'm going to be presenting some of the research that I'm doing. So yeah, so if you're going to that, you can, hopefully see my poster. Don't forget you can sign up for our Patreon if you want to keep supporting the channel, and you can also check out our Discord where we at least have some discussions about some of these paleontology ethics bits. but also just general paleontology. So whatever you're interested in. I know there's been some people who have been worried about how they're trying to work out with school and, giving some advice just through experience, and that's with everyone who's there. It's a nice community we got. With that in mind, everyone, be safe, take care, wear a mask, get your vaccine. I swear, just do it. And don't go extinct.